The humid air of Washington, D.C. pressed heavily against the windows of the White House, where Winston Churchill sat, the smoke from his cigar curling like a grey phantom in the lamplight. Across from him, maps of Europe lay sprawled across the mahogany table, marked with the positions of men who were more than symbols, but the living instruments of his nation's survival. He thought of Bernard Montgomery, the hero of El Alamein, a man whose discipline was as sharp as a bayonet and whose confidence bordered on the divine. Montgomery was a soldier's soldier, a British icon who demanded perfection and total control. Yet Churchill felt a growing tremor of doubt regarding the general's ability to play the delicate game of international alliance. Outside, the distant hum of the American capital served as a constant reminder that the British Empire was no longer the sole architect of the Western world's fate. Churchill looked at the reports from the Pentagon, noting the rising influence of American commanders who brought with them a different philosophy of war. Among them was Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man whose military record lacked the flamboyant victories of Montgomery, but whose presence commanded a strange, quiet respect. While Montgomery was a master of the set-piece battle, Eisenhower seemed to be a master of the human soul, navigating the egos of generals and politicians with a grace that Churchill found both puzzling and intriguing. The tension began to manifest during a high-level briefing, where Montgomery's rigid demands for resources threatened to alienate the American generals. Churchill watched from the shadows of the room as Montgomery spoke with a condescending certainty that made the Americans shift uncomfortably in their seats. The British general insisted on a singular line of command that prioritized his own movements, dismissing the logistical concerns of his counterparts as mere inconveniences. It was a display of tactical brilliance but diplomatic failure, a friction point that Churchill knew could cause the entire Allied machinery to grind to a halt if left unchecked. Eisenhower, sitting at the far end of the table, did not interrupt or challenge Montgomery's expertise with fire. Instead, he listened with a patience that seemed almost unnatural given the stakes. Churchill noticed how Eisenhower's eyes moved across the room, gauging the reactions of the other men, absorbing the frustration that Montgomery was so casually sowing. When Eisenhower finally spoke, his voice was not a roar of command, but a bridge of compromise, acknowledging Montgomery's genius while gently reorienting the discussion toward the collective goal. It was a subtle shift, a display of leadership that did not require the spotlight to be effective, and for the first time, Churchill felt a flicker of realization. Later that evening, walking through the gardens of the British Embassy, Churchill reflected on the weight of the crown and the burden of history that he carried on his shoulders. He knew that the British public adored Montgomery, seeing him as the reincarnation of Wellington, a man who could not be defeated. To favor an American over such a national hero would be a political risk of the highest order, one that could strain the morale of his own people. Yet the war was changing, evolving into a global industrial struggle where no single nation, no matter how storied its history, could claim total dominance over the strategy. He recalled a private conversation with Montgomery, where the general had dismissed Eisenhower as a mere clerk in uniform, lacking the fire of a true warrior. Churchill had smiled at the time, but now that smile felt brittle and hollow as he considered the logistical nightmare of D-Day and the coordination it would require. He saw the pride in Montgomery's posture, the way he wore his beret as a crown, and compared it to the functional, almost modest attire of the American general. One man fought for the glory of the empire and the precision of the line. The other seemed to be fighting for the survival of a shared future. The sound of a distant siren echoed through the streets of Washington, a reminder that the world was still burning while they debated titles and hierarchies. Churchill stopped to light a fresh cigar, the match flare illuminating the deep lines of exhaustion on his face, lines carved by years of making impossible choices. He began to see that Montgomery's rigidity which had saved them in the desert, might become a liability in the complex tapestry of a multinational invasion. The clerk that Montgomery mocked was the only man who seemed capable of holding the temperamental Free French, the skeptical Americans, and the exhausted British together. As the night deepened, Churchill received a dispatch detailing another disagreement between Montgomery and the American Air Force commanders regarding tactical support. It was a minor dispute in the grand scheme of the war, but it represented a pattern of friction that the Prime Minister could no longer afford to ignore. He realized that the ego of a great general could be just as dangerous as the maneuvers of the enemy if it fractured the trust of the Allies. The trigger had been pulled, the observation phase was over, and Churchill knew he had to look closer at the man from Abilene, Kansas. He decided then to arrange more informal meetings, to see Eisenhower away from the theatricality of the war room and the pressure of the maps. He wanted to see if the Americans' calm was a mask or a foundation, and if Montgomery's brilliance was worth the cost of the resentment he left in his wake. The transition of power was not a single event, but a slow erosion of old certainties, a process that pained Churchill's imperial heart, even as his strategic mind demanded it. The future was no longer a British secret, it was a shared burden, and the man who would carry it was becoming clearer by the hour. The chapter of British unilateralism was closing, and Churchill felt the cold wind of change, even in the summer heat of the United States. He looked at a photograph of Montgomery on his desk, the hero of the hour, and then at a memo signed simply Eisenhower. He realized that the war would not be won by the man who wanted to be the hero, but by the man who was willing to let others believe they were. With a heavy sigh, he turned out the lamp, leaving the maps in darkness as the realization began to take firm root in his mind. The following days were a study in contrast as Churchill traveled between command centers, observing the two men in their natural elements. In the field, Montgomery was a god among his troops, his presence revitalizing the weary British soldiers who saw in him the promise of a disciplined victory. He moved with a theatrical flair, his speeches rehearsed to perfection, instilling a sense of nationalistic pride that was essential for the British morale. However, when the cameras were off and the diplomats entered the tent, that same pride turned into a wall of stone that refused to bend to the needs of the coalition. Churchill watched as Montgomery dismissed an American proposal for joint logistical depots, calling it amateurish and clumsy without considering the political implications of his words. The American officers, many of whom were providing the very trucks and fuel Montgomery relied upon, grew silent and cold, their resentment simmering just beneath the surface. It was a dangerous game, Churchill thought, to bite the hand that was feeding the war machine simply because the hand did not wear a British glove. He saw the cracks in the alliance widening, not because of a lack of courage, but because of a lack of humility from his finest commander. In contrast, Eisenhower's headquarters at Telegraph Cottage felt less like a Roman triumph and more like a bustling corporate office where the product was survival. Eisenhower was constantly on the telephone or in small, smoky rooms, mediating disputes between British admirals and American generals who could not agree on landing zones. He did not demand loyalty. He earned it by listening to grievances that Montgomery would have dismissed with a wave of his hand. Churchill noticed that Eisenhower never claimed credit for a successful plan, instead using the word "we" with a frequency that felt both genuine and strategically brilliant. The conflict between the two styles reached a boiling point during a dinner at Chequers, where Montgomery and Eisenhower were both present under Churchill's watchful eye. Montgomery took the floor, lecturing the table on the necessity of a single ground commander, a role he clearly intended for himself, to oversee all land operations in Europe. His tone was that of a schoolmaster addressing unruly children, and the silence that followed was heavy with the unspoken anger of the American representatives. Churchill glanced at Eisenhower, expecting a rebuttal or a show of force to defend American interests. but the general remained calm. Eisenhower waited for Montgomery to finish his flourish before speaking, and when he did, he didn't attack the plan. He attacked the problem of unity. He spoke of the Great Crusade as a collective effort where the rank of the commander mattered less than the trust between the nations. He managed to make Montgomery's demand for power seem small and self-serving without ever mentioning the man's name, a feat of rhetorical gymnastics that left Churchill deeply impressed. The Prime Minister saw that while Montgomery was fighting the Germans, Eisenhower was fighting the friction that could defeat them all before they even reached the beaches. The moral dilemma for Churchill was profound. He was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and his duty was to advance British interests and British glory. Montgomery represented the peak of British military achievement, and to sideline him in favor of an American was a bitter pill that tasted of the decline of empire. Yet, every time he spoke with Montgomery, he felt the exhaustion of trying to manage the general's ego, a task that was becoming a second war in itself. Eisenhower, on the other hand, made Churchill feel like a partner, someone who understood that the political landscape was just as treacherous as the minefields of Normandy. Social pressures also mounted as the British press continued to lionize Montgomery, creating a public expectation that he would be the supreme leader of the coming invasion. Churchill knew that if he handed over the reins to Eisenhower, he would have to explain to the King and the Parliament why a Briton was not leading the charge. It was a question of national identity, a conflict between the nostalgic desire for British dominance and the cold reality of American industrial and manpower superiority. He watched Eisenhower handle a group of skeptical British MPs, winning them over with his Midwestern charm and undeniable sincerity, and felt the weight of the decision shifting. Montgomery's letters to Churchill became increasingly frustrated, filled with complaints about the lack of decisiveness in the American command and the muddle of the coalition structure. He seemed unable to grasp that the muddle was the price of democracy and that Eisenhower's role was to navigate that mess, not to ignore it. Churchill read these letters with a growing sense of weariness, realizing that Montgomery was a man of the past, a brilliant relic of a time when wars were won by the sheer will of a single great captain. Eisenhower was the man of the future, a manager of complexity in an age of total interconnected war. The tension was not just between the men, but within Churchill himself as he navigated the halls of power, trying to balance these two titanic personalities. He saw the way the American generals rallied around Eisenhower, not because they feared him, but because they felt protected by him. Montgomery, meanwhile, inspired fear and respect, but very little love outside of his own inner circle, creating a vacuum of goodwill that was dangerous for a long campaign. Churchill realized that in the coming struggle they would need more than a tactician. They would need a diplomat who could keep the Americans from going home and the British from giving up. As the chapter of preparation drew to a close, Churchill found himself sitting alone with a glass of whiskey, listening to the rain against the window. He had seen the paths diverging. One led to a potential British victory that might shatter the alliance, and the other led to a collective victory that required the sacrifice of British ego. The path of Montgomery was the path of the lion, noble, fierce, and solitary. The path of Eisenhower was the path of the weaver, patient, inclusive, and enduring. Churchill knew which one the world needed, even if it broke his heart to admit it. The breaking point arrived not with a thunderclap, but with a series of quiet, devastating revelations during the final planning phases of Operation Overlord. A major dispute erupted over the use of heavy bombers, with Montgomery demanding they be placed under his direct control for the tactical support of his troops. The American air commanders were furious, threatening to escalate the matter to President Roosevelt, a move that would have created a diplomatic crisis at the most sensitive moment of the war. Churchill watched as the fragile architecture of the alliance began to vibrate with the frequency of an impending collapse, driven by Montgomery's refusal to see the larger picture. In a heated meeting behind closed doors, Montgomery stood before the maps and declared that he would not accept responsibility for a failure caused by American indecision. It was a statement that struck at the very heart of the coalition, a public indictment of his partners that left the room in a state of shocked silence. Churchill felt a surge of anger, not just at the insolence, but at the sheer short-sightedness of a man who would risk the entire invasion over a matter of command hierarchy. He looked at the faces of the American officers and saw the quiebra, the moment where trust was replaced by a cold, professional disdain that could not be easily repaired. Eisenhower, for the first time, looked visibly tired, the lines around his eyes deepening as he stared at the floor while Montgomery spoke. When he finally looked up, there was no anger in his expression, only a profound and weary disappointment that was far more cutting than any shout. He didn't argue with Montgomery. Instead, he looked at Churchill and simply asked if the British government still believed in the principle of unified command. It was a direct challenge to the Prime Minister's leadership, forcing Churchill to choose between his national hero and the survival of the Allied cause. Churchill felt the betrayal of the moment, not a betrayal of country, but a betrayal of the common sense that had sustained the British Empire for centuries. He realized that Montgomery's brilliance had become a cage, preventing him from growing into the leader the era demanded. The quiebra was internal for Churchill as well. He had to let go of the idea that Britain could lead this war on its own terms. He saw the cold reality that Montgomery, for all his medals and victories, was fundamentally incapable of the emotional intelligence required to lead an army of millions from different cultures. That night, Churchill invited Eisenhower for a private discussion away from the prying eyes of the staff and the lingering tension of the war room. They sat in a small study, the air thick with the smell of old paper and the weight of the decisions they were about to formalize. Churchill probed Eisenhower's resolve, asking him how he planned to handle the Montgomery problem without causing a mutiny among the British troops. Eisenhower's response was devastating in its simplicity. He said he would give Montgomery the glory of the battle, but never the keys to the alliance. This revelation was the final blow to Churchill's lingering hopes for a British-led victory in the traditional sense. He saw that Eisenhower had already outmaneuvered Montgomery, not by being a better soldier, but by being a better leader of men. Eisenhower understood that the real battle was not just against the Germans, but against the internal decay of the coalition. Churchill felt a sense of loss, a mourning for the era of the great British generalissimo, replaced by the era of the American Supreme Commander. The crisis intensified when Montgomery leaked his frustrations to a segment of the British press, hoping to use public opinion to force Churchill's hand. This backfired spectacularly, as the Americans interpreted it as a sign of British duplicity, leading to a week of icy silence between London and Washington. Churchill had to spend precious hours on the transatlantic line, smoothing over the damage caused by his own general's ego. It was a humiliating experience for a man of Churchill's stature, and it solidified his growing conviction that Montgomery had to be managed, not followed. During a final review of the invasion plans, Montgomery once again tried to dominate the session, but the atmosphere had changed. The other commanders no longer looked to him for approval. They looked to Eisenhower, who had quietly built a consensus behind the scenes. Montgomery's voice, once so commanding, now sounded shrill and out of sync with the room, like a soloist who had forgotten the rest of the orchestra was playing a different piece. Churchill sat at the head of the table, observing the shift in gravity, the way the power was flowing toward the American with the steady inevitability of a tide. The quiebra was complete when Churchill, in a rare moment of bluntness, told Montgomery in private that the alliance comes before the individual. no matter how great that individual may be. Montgomery's reaction was one of stunned disbelief, as if he couldn't conceive of a world where his tactical genius wasn't the ultimate currency. Churchill felt a pang of pity for his old friend, but it was overshadowed by the relief of finally acknowledging the truth. The future had arrived, and it didn't look like a British parade. It looked like an American assembly line. As he walked back to his quarters, Churchill felt the weight of the Quebra easing into a somber clarity. He had witnessed the transition of global leadership in a single room, among a few men and a pile of maps. He knew that the history books would focus on the battles, the tanks, and the liberated cities, but the true turning point was this: the moment the British Prime Minister realized that the man from Kansas was the only one who could save them. The break was clean, painful, and absolutely necessary for the victory that lay ahead. In the wake of the internal crisis, the atmosphere within the Allied command shifted into a state of high-pressure professionalism that left little room for Montgomery's theatrics. Churchill noticed that the American generals, once hesitant, were now emboldened by Eisenhower's firm but fair handling of the situation. The consequence of Churchill's silent shift in support was an immediate streamlining of the D-Day preparations as Eisenhower's staff took the lead in logistical and strategic coordination. The British officers, sensing the change in the wind, began to adapt, though a lingering sense of national wounded pride remained in the mess halls and briefing rooms. Montgomery, though still in command of the 21st Army Group, found himself increasingly isolated from the core strategic decisions that would define the post-invasion landscape. He became a specialist, a man brought in to execute a specific, brutal task rather than the architect of the grand campaign. Churchill watched as Montgomery retreated into a shell of professional excellence, sharpening his plans for the beaches with an almost obsessive focus, perhaps sensing that his window for supreme influence was closing. The consequence for Montgomery was a loss of political capital that he would never fully recover, a slow fading of his star in the eyes of the man who mattered most, Churchill. For Churchill himself, the consequences were a mix of strategic relief and personal melancholy as he navigated the final months before the invasion. He had to play a double game, continuing to publicly champion Montgomery to maintain British morale while privately reinforcing Eisenhower's authority at every turn. This required a level of political duplicity that weighed on his conscience, as he had always valued the directness of the soldierly bond. He felt the sting of the waning British influence every time he had to defer to Eisenhower's judgment on matters of resource allocation or troop movements. The relationship between the two nations, however, began to heal and strengthen under the new clarity of command. With the Montgomery problem contained, the flow of information and cooperation between the Pentagon and the War Office reached an unprecedented level of efficiency. Churchill saw that by empowering Eisenhower, he had unlocked the full potential of the American war machine, which was now pouring into Britain with a terrifying and magnificent scale. The streets of London were filled with GIs, and the sky was dark with American planes, a physical manifestation of the shift in power that Churchill had accepted in his heart. There was a growing emotional weariness in the command centers as the date for the invasion approached, a collective realization of the human cost that would soon be paid. Churchill noticed that Eisenhower carried this burden differently than Montgomery. While Montgomery spoke of attrition and objectives, Eisenhower spoke of the boys who would not be coming back. This empathy, which Montgomery might have seen as a weakness, became a source of strength for the coalition, humanizing the cold mathematics of war. Churchill found himself drawn to Eisenhower's humanity, finding it a more sustainable fuel for the long struggle than Montgomery's cold perfectionism. The social fabric of the British command was also changing as younger officers began to emulate Eisenhower's collaborative style rather than Montgomery's autocratic one. The consequence was a modernization of the British military mind, a realization that the wars of the future would require a more integrated and flexible approach to leadership. Churchill observed these young men with a mixture of pride and sadness, knowing they were the first generation of a new world order that Britain would no longer lead alone. The old school, the world of the great captain, was dying, and Churchill was its chief mourner and its executioner. During a visit to the troops, Churchill saw Montgomery and Eisenhower standing together for a press event, the two men representing the past and the future of the Allied effort. Montgomery looked stiff and impeccable, a figure of the 19th century ideal, while Eisenhower looked approachable and modern, his smile hiding the immense pressure of the millions of lives in his hands. Churchill realized then that the public needed the image of Montgomery, but the soldiers needed the reality of Eisenhower. The consequence of his insight was a strategic balance that kept the public inspired while the operation remained functional. The friction didn't disappear entirely, of course. Montgomery still sent biting memos, and the Americans still grumbled about British caution. However, the Quebra had established a hierarchy that was now beyond challenge, with Eisenhower's word being the final law of the land. Churchill found that his own role had shifted from being the primary strategist to being the ultimate arbiter, the man who kept the peace between these two powerful forces. It was a role that required all of his legendary wit and stamina, but it was a role that he now performed with the certainty of knowing he had chosen the right horse for the race. As the ships began to gather in the ports and the troops moved toward the coast, the consequences of Churchill's realization became visible in the sheer unity of the fleet. There was no British fleet or American fleet in the eyes of the command. There was only the Allied fleet, a single massive organism directed by a single mind. Churchill stood on the cliffs of Dover, looking out at the grey expanse of the Channel, feeling the immense gravity of what they were about to attempt. He knew that if he had stayed with Montgomery's path, that fleet might have been divided by pride and fractured by ego. The final consequence was a sense of peace that Churchill hadn't felt since the war began. A grim, determined peace, but peace nonetheless. He had made the hard choice, the choice that favored the survival of the world over the prestige of his own generals. He went back to his maps, not as a man trying to force his will on the world, but as a man who had aligned himself with the inevitable flow of history. The transition was complete, the stage was set, and the man from Kansas was ready to lead them into the storm. The resolution of this quiet drama did not culminate in a grand ceremony, but in the grey, cold dawn of June 6, 1944. As the reports began to trickle back from the beaches of Normandy, Churchill sat in the map room, his eyes fixed on the progress of the landing craft. He saw the British divisions under Montgomery's tactical guidance, fighting with a ferocity that justified every medal the general had ever won. But he also saw the American, Canadian, and Free French forces moving in a coordinated dance that would have been impossible without Eisenhower's months of diplomatic labor. The victory was taking shape, and it was a victory that belonged to the coalition, not to any one man's ego. Churchill watched the ticker tape and listened to the radio reports, feeling a profound sense of vindication as the news confirmed that the front was holding. He realized that the resolution of his conflict was not just about winning the war, but about how the war was being won, with a level of international cooperation that was unprecedented in human history. Montgomery's role in the invasion was brilliant, his execution of the landings a masterclass in military science, but it was Eisenhower who was managing the fallout, the reinforcements, and the political storms that followed the first wave. Churchill saw the two men now for exactly what they were, the blade and the hand that swung it. In the days following D-Day, Churchill made a trip to the beachhead, meeting with both Montgomery and Eisenhower in the field. Montgomery was in his element, surrounded by the smoke and thunder of the front line, already planning the next great thrust toward Caen. He was a man of the moment, a warrior of the immediate and the tactile, and Churchill gave him the praise he deserved. But when Churchill met with Eisenhower in a modest tent further inland, the conversation was not about the next hill, but about the next 6 months. The logistics of the liberation, the governance of France, and the long road to Berlin. The resolution for Churchill was the final acceptance that his own role in history was changing from the leader of a global empire to the senior partner in a new Western alliance. He saw Eisenhower as the bridge to that future, a man who could lead the Americans into a permanent role in European security, something that was essential for the peace that would follow. By choosing Eisenhower over Montgomery for the supreme leadership, Churchill had secured more than a military victory. He had secured the future of the Atlantic Alliance. He felt a strange sense of relief, as if a great weight had been lifted from his chest, replaced by a cold but stable clarity. Montgomery's later attempts to regain supreme command during the Battle of the Bulge were met with a firm and final no from both Washington and London. Churchill did not hesitate to back Eisenhower this time, knowing that the pattern he had recognized months before was now an immutable law of the war. The resolution was clear. The era of the individual British hero was over, and the era of the collective democratic command had begun. Montgomery remained a great general, but he was no longer the face of the Allied will, a fact that even he eventually had to accept in the face of Eisenhower's success. As the war in Europe drew to a close, Churchill found himself reflecting on the long journey from that smoky room in Washington to the ruins of Berlin. He saw that his judgment of Eisenhower had been correct. The man had held the alliance together through some of the darkest moments of the campaign, never wavering and never letting his ego get in the way of the mission. Eisenhower had become a world figure, a symbol of a new kind of leadership that was as much about listening as it was about commanding. Churchill felt a quiet pride in having been the one to recognize this potential and to provide the space for it to flourish. The final resolution was a personal one for Churchill, a moment of humility that few in the public ever saw. He realized that his greatest contribution to the war effort might not have been his speeches or his tactical suggestions, but his willingness to step back and allow the right man to lead. It was a lesson in the nature of power, that sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is to recognize someone else's superior fitness for the task at hand. He looked at the final maps of a liberated Europe and saw the handiwork of a man who had built a team, not just an army. In his final meetings with the king, Churchill spoke of Eisenhower with a warmth and respect that bypassed nationalistic rivalry, describing him as one of the greatest Europeans, despite his American birth. He had helped the king understand that the future of the monarchy and the empire depended on this new relationship, and that Eisenhower was the human embodiment of that bond. The resolution of the story was the birth of the special relationship, forged in the fire of the conflict and tempered by the wisdom of a prime minister who knew when to let go. As the lights went on across London to celebrate the end of the war, Churchill stood on the balcony of the Ministry of Health, waving to the cheering crowds. He saw the flags of all the Allied nations waving together, a sight that would have been impossible if the command had fractured under the weight of Montgomery's pride. He thought of Eisenhower, probably already working on the next set of problems in some quiet office, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. The future was here, and it was in good hands. The story ended not with a bang, but with a quiet nod of recognition from one statesman to another. Churchill had seen the future, and while it wasn't the British century he had dreamed of as a young man, it was a century that would be free because he had the courage to choose the right leader. He closed the door on the map room for the last time, the cigar smoke lingering in the air like the memory of a hard-won peace. The realization was complete, the war was won, and the legacy of his choice would endure for generations to come.